Hey, it's Tim here. In today's video, we're going to be looking at the window function. Now, the difficult thing with this function is that it actually applies to a whole range of functions in one go. So what I'm going to focus on purely in this video is just to describe how the window capability of any window function works. And we're going to use a window sum, essentially to show this behavior, because aggregations are probably easier when they're done in sums. That's how our brain naturally works. We like to add things up. So we're going to hop into Tableau and I'm going to show you how this works. Okay, so for the record, I always use the same data source. I'm always using Superstore Sales, and you can get to it by selecting one of these two data sets. You won't have exactly the same numbers as me, but if you use any of these two data sets, you'll have all the same columns and fields, and you'll be able to follow along just using this data set. So let's go ahead and click on the second data source here. This actually gives us the global Superstore Sales. This tends to be the data source that most people have installed on their machine. Now, in order to show you this, I want to build a very simple table. So I'm going to grab sales and place it on text. And then I'm also going to grab the subcategory and place it on rows. And this will simply show us the subcategory totals. There's an aggregation working here for sum of sales that's being shown here across all these rows. Now, the next thing I'd like to do is to grab the date. Now, when I grab a date and put it on columns, Tableau defaults to the year. And so you can see here that it's essentially aggregating to the year, and it's built us this nice crosstab. Now, we don't like tables in Tableau. Coincidentally, that's why tables don't perform too well here in this data set. But nonetheless, what we're going to do now is add a second category element here. We're going to put it in front of the subcategory just to give our table some partitions that we can use later on in this tutorial. Okay, now we're pretty much set up. I'm actually going to open a calculation window straight away. It's actually opened up on my other screen. So let me bring it here into view and you can see it sort of working. I'm going to set this up so you can see it all the time whilst I've got this calculation window open. So I'll make it narrow. I'll put it on the bottom. Then I'll open this right-hand side panel. The reason I want to open the right-hand side panel is because in there we actually get some really useful assistance for how the window function works. So let's go in there and just type in window. And you can see earlier on I said there's actually several functions here. They're actually all highlighted here. So essentially the window function works for any function that's essentially an aggregation. So your averages, your counts, your max, mins, medians, sums, average, and even the standard deviation. And so you're probably wondering, well, what does window specifically mean? How does that actually work? How does that work in a visualization? How does it work in a table? First, we're going to take on a simple table like the one I've got in front of us, and we're going to just try and set up our calculation to work properly. So I'm actually going to just type this calculation out. I'm just going to type in window sum of sales as the name of our calculation. And what we're going to do is we're just going to type in the function window sum. And I'll go down this list and I'll select sum by hitting enter, and I'll make this larger so you can all see what I'm doing. And now that I've done this, you can see that Tableau is complaining because it's expecting an expression. And so what you have to put in here is some sort of aggregation. Essentially, the window sum is going to use this aggregation as its driving mechanic. It's basically going to control how the window sum behaves. And because we've got sum of sales just here in our window, what I'd like to do is put that inside of my window sum so we can see what the window sum function or what the window function actually does to a sum of sales. Now, it's a little bit confusing because you could, for example, use a window average and inside of that put sum of sales. And that will actually do an interesting calculation that I'll show you a little later. But nevertheless, let's stick to window sum for sum of sales. And I'll just hold command on a Mac here and drag it in. If you hold control on the Windows, it will essentially copy it in. And it avoids any sort of typos that you might have. So now we have this set up. I'm just going to hit apply. And when I do that, it essentially puts this window sum here on the left-hand side so we can use it as a calculation. Now, if you're using an older version of Tableau, it might appear anywhere here on the left-hand side. Just basically try and make sure you find the calculation. But if you name it well, you'll be able to find it very easily. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to grab this window sum and place it inside of our table. This is like a little shorthand. You can see that it says show me here. Essentially, Tableau will suggest a way of showing this information. So when I place it in the table, you can see that it actually does work, and we get a second section here on the right hand side for our window sum of sales. And so at this point, we've essentially set up our window sum. Everything is working and it's pretty much good to go. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about this function is when we've given it sort of no instructions, it's just going to operate in this sort of standard way. And so what we can see here straight away is that if we look on our table, especially if we look across here, you'll see that all of these values are the same. And it's pretty much the same in every single row. So what exactly is going on? Well, let's break it down. We know that the direction of the calculation is going across the table. And so what I'll do is I'll just bring out the summary tool. The summary tool is like a calculator, and essentially it's super handy. When you open it up, it opens it up here on the right-hand side. And just in case you missed that, I did that quite quickly. The summary option is just here. There's a handy thing on a Mac actually where you can just type in the thing you're looking for, and if you don't sort of type it badly, if you hover over the thing, it actually shows you where the function is. I find this really useful on Macs. I don't know why Windows machines don't have this, but you can see that the summary option is just there in the worksheet section. And when you click on that, it opens it up and it brings it over here. You can actually just grab it and drag it just underneath the filters pane here, just so that you can see it in context of the view. So now that we've done this, the last thing I'm going to do to make this summary window work a bit better for us is I'm just going to drag this little gap here open a little bit wider so we can see the whole number. Then I'm going to go to tooltip, and I don't care about tooltips right now. I just want to show you how the window sum works. So I'm going to disable the tooltip so they don't get in the way of the demo. And so what this allows me to do is click in each of these, and you can see that the summary window changes to basically act like a calculator. It's going to basically sum up everything that I click on, and it's going to be a really handy feature. So let's now try and use this to see if this 114,000 is actually some sort of aggregation that we're missing. So let's hold command, and I'll just select these top row items. And you can see that actually when I do that, these items here equal 114,880, which coincidentally is actually what we see over here in the top row. And so we now kind of have an idea of how this is working. Now, if I deselect this and I just leave everything so that to come back, you can see that this is actually working across the entire table. So everything is going across. And for some of you who are very astute, you will have noticed that it does indeed say here, table across. And so this gives us a hint that this is one of those functions that has some sort of direction related to it. And because we're on the table, it's working across, it goes from left to right. And the important thing to bear in mind here is that it's doing the sum of cells inside of the window function. So in essence, if I take the sum of cells and draw a box around it, what the window function is doing is that for each row, it's essentially working from left to right. Now I'm trying to figure out what annotation tool to use here. So I'll just use this sort of manual highlighter. So it's essentially starting here on the left, and it's totaling everything up. And then once it's done that, it's returning the value for the whole thing. So it's basically giving us 114,000 on every row. It's a little like doing an LOD to the subcategory. It's essentially going to give us the same value if we do an LOD just on subcategory and sort of ignore everything else. Okay. So now that we've started to sort of see what's going on, let's play around with the direction a little bit more just to see what else is going to happen here. So to do that, I actually need to just go here to the bottom left hand side. You'll see there's a little arrow in there. It's actually a triangle. I don't know why I said an arrow, but if I click on it, you'll see that it disappears. And if I click on it again, there's a little bug where it sort of doesn't do what I want it to do. But nevertheless, I can actually go into this little drop down, and you can see I get a range of directions. Now, these directions are very, very common in table calculations. And once you get to know this, you really start to understand the power of what's going on, especially when you work in a sort of a table setup like this. Let's change it to table down and see what happens. So when we change it to table down, you see the number completely changes. And my guess here is that it's working from the top to the bottom, hence table down. And so actually, if I just go and do this, I'm going to hold shift, select the top one, hold shift, select the bottom one, and it didn't select all of them. So what I'm just going to do, I'm just going to select every single one manually. It doesn't want to do what I want it to do today. So we're just going to suffer a little bit. And if we add all those up, you can see that it actually equals 484,247, which is indeed what we have going all the way down this row. So we're now starting to understand a bit more about what direction is doing, and we kind of have an idea of what the window function is doing. It seems to be adding everything up in a specific context. But what do we really mean by this concept of a window? Well, in order to show you that, I'm actually going to need to use the function in its full form. Okay, so if I actually bring this calculation window up so we can block a bit of the table, and I expand this further down, you can see that there's actually some additional notation that we haven't used. If I just highlight this description to you here, you can see that there's actually a way of writing this so we can actually specify the size of the window. So far, we haven't specified anything. If you actually look here on the end, we've not specified any sort of size of the window. So what I can actually do is I can go into this little space. We can type in a 0, comma, and then a 0. And this is actually going to cause us an error. Now I'm missing a parentheses here. I need to make sure that I've closed this off. So that one is being closed off there. And this window one is being closed off out here. So where am I missing a parentheses? I think I'm actually missing a comma here. So if I just do a comma there, that should make the calculation valid. And that should be good. I had a sort of temporary mind blank there. And so now you can see that this is working properly. And so what we've done is essentially we've told Tableau to define the window with 0 and 0. Think of these as coordinates. And when I hit apply, you'll see that all the numbers go back to behaving as normal. Okay. So what is the actual window? Well, there's another notation that I'm going to introduce you to, and that is the term first and last. I'm going to write these on a new line here using a single line comment, and I'm just going to type this in first, like so, and last, like so. Now, for some of you, you might have gone, why didn't you do a multi-line comment? I'm an old hack. I like to do things the old way, okay? So nonetheless, here we are, and we've got these two terms. And what do they mean? Well, let me change this value here to last, and I'm just going to put that there, and you'll see that now my calculation is valid. So I've replaced the last 0 with last. And now if we hit apply, the numbers change again. So what is happening here? Well, there's a couple of things happening, and it's super confusing unless I explain it really, really clearly. So let me move my table out the way. Now, for those of you who are astute, you will have realized that we still have our table down calculation working, because you'll see this over here. It's working from the top down. And so if we look at the bottom of our table, you can see the values actually add up. So 77 and 77,000 add up there on both sides. So let's have a look at the next row above it. If we look at this, it says 139,414. So my hunch is that it's adding up these two columns. And so let's try and add these up here in Tableau. So let's click on 77 and 62. And indeed, you do get 139,000. And that is actually the value that we get onto this line. Okay, so what this calculation is doing, and I'm going to try and explain it in the best possible way I can, and I hope this is clear, is that we're actually describing the size of something called a window. And for the first row in our data, it's going from the current row, 0. So this 0 is essentially going from our current row over here. And the last row is essentially, I'm going to highlight this in blue. And I'm going to use the right annotation as well. It's a little bit late here, so I'm really flagging. But nevertheless, I'll go and highlight this with an arrow and show you the last column is over here. Okay, so 0 means basically the current row, and last means go all the way to the end. So for the first row, what it's going to do is it's going to go in here and it's going to do the sum. It's going to do a window sum of the sum of cells. So it's going to grab all of these sum of cells values. So you can see, I'm just going to highlight these in a box. It's going to grab all of these, add them up, and then it's going to return the value over here onto the top row. So that's what it's going to do on row 1. Okay. Now let's guess what it's going to do on row number 2. Now on row number 2, the current row is actually now this one here. So it's going to do this, and it's going to go to the last row again, and it's going to add them up, and it's going to return the value right there. And so if I was to do this, if I was to grab 72,000, 4615, all of these, I should, if the calculator works correctly, get 464,211, which is indeed what we get over there. It's just grayed out, but if I click on it, you'll see that that's the value that we're getting. So essentially, this window sum of cells is actually defining them some sort of square or window where the calculation is operating. And because it's a window sum, its natural behavior is to aggregate everything in that window. Now, I could have said window average, and what it would do instead is it would find the average of all of those values. So let's change that. But before we do, let's try and guess the number that we're going to get first. So let's go ahead and select these two here. these few items here. Oh man, I cannot talk today. So let's keep going. And you'll see here that the average is 29,013. So window average, all we're going to do is change this window sum to a window average, and that's the value we should see in this row here. Okay, so we're going to change it and we're going to see what happens. So let's go here and do an average. Bear in mind, we're doing a window average of the sum of cells. So essentially it's grabbing all the sum of cells, then it's calculating the average of those values. And the average is basically all the rows divided by all the sum of the items divided by the number of rows. And so let's hit apply. Drum roll. Indeed, we did get 29,013. Okay, so we now know how the window function works, essentially. In summary, you're defining a window, and that window is defined by essentially the coordinates that you give Tableau, represented here at the very end. Now, this can get very interesting because as well as last, you can also have something called first. So let's click on this and clear this, and let's go and change this value here to first so we can see what's going on. And now I'm going to change this last to 0. I can't spell first for the record, so that's why it's thrown an error. So let's go ahead and do that and type in first. And now you'll see that the calculation is indeed valid here at the bottom. Okay, so now let's hit apply. And now you'll see our calculation is back to normal. And I'm going to, for posterity's sake, return this to sum so we can track the actual change a little bit more easily, and hit apply. And now what we've done is we've flipped the question the other way around. Before, what we had is we had the window function starting at the top and drawing all the way to the bottom and doing this. And then when it went to the second row, it basically drew the window like this. And when it went to the third row, it did the window like this. What we've essentially done with this is we've flipped that the other way around. Instead, what it's doing is it's going to the bottom, okay? And it's actually drawing the table from the bottom up. So the last row here, 40,247, is going to be adding up all the values above it. And if I go to the second last row, it's going to be basically going like this and doing that. And so it's essentially sort of using the bottom as its sort of anchoring point, if that makes sense. So if I look at this top value, it's 20,037. And if I add 20,037 to 97,000, that is indeed what we get over here. So it's essentially just doing exactly the same as what we were doing before, except for it's doing it in the opposite order. It's sort of reversed the direction that we were using it in. So we know what first does and we know what last does. In the context of the table or the chart that you're using, first basically means the first row that you're on, and last basically means the last row that you're on. And the window is everything in between those two places, okay? This is why if I change this first value to 0, and we just do coordinate system of 0 and 0, this essentially is going to do exactly the same as the sum of cells. If I hit apply, we just have a table that looks exactly like our sum of cells, because essentially we're defining the window in exactly the same way that Tableau already aggregates tables. Essentially, the window in this case is just start on the current row and finish on the current row. And then on the next row, it starts on the current row and finish on the current row. There's nothing sort of complex about that. So then you might be asking, well, what can we do with this? Can we change those numbers and just go crazy? Well, absolutely. Let's change this number here to 1 and hit apply. And now it's doing something slightly different. Because I changed the last number, anytime you change the number on the right, what you have to do is actually go to the bottom of the table, because remember, it's referencing the last row. So because I changed this number here on the right, I should actually start to look for a difference here on the bottom. So if I start with 77,000, there's nothing new here. Now, if I add 77 and 67,000, I get 139. We've actually seen this number already before, and that is indeed what we get there. Okay. Now, on the next row, we don't seem to be sort of going up in value. So let's try and see what's happening here. If I start on 62,000 and I hit 10,850, you see I get 72,873, which is actually this row over here. So in essence, I've actually defined my window in this sort of tight box of two rows. So let's just sort of try and draw that so you can sort of see what's going on. So on the bottom row, it's going to basically just define itself as this little box here. And because there's nothing in this sort of space below, there's sort of nothing for it to add. So it just returns 77,391 to this box over here on the right-hand side. On the next row, that changes a little bit. I'll do this in blue so it's clearer. The window moves up, and now I'm going to essentially just draw a box around these two. It's going to add those up, and then it's going to return the value over here on the right-hand side. Okay, and that's going to work its way up. So this window is going to sort of slowly work its way up. On the next row, I'm going to leave the previous one highlighted. It's going to draw a box around these two. It's going to add those up, and then it's going to return the value, of course, over here. And that's how this is working. So this window is this concept of like an invisible window that's moving through our table. It's moving through our numbers, and it's doing the aggregation that you tell it, sum or average. Now that is different from the value or expression that's actually inside of it. So this whole time we've used sum of sales, but actually the aggregation that happens in the window is defined by what's going on here. Okay, so now hopefully you start to get an idea of what this can do. You can start to kind of go crazy with this. Okay, what we're going to do now is change it to table across. You're probably thinking, okay, you've absolutely murdered the point, but we really haven't, because there's more to this function than meets the eye. Let's go and change this from table across to table across then down. Okay. And so you're thinking, okay, what's actually going on here? Okay, now we're not done with this function yet. What we're going to do, we've set this completely. You can see here that it's going to table across, and you can see that the coordinates are reset back to 0 and 0. And what we're going to do now is set this to table across then down. And you're probably wondering, well, what's going on here? Okay, well, let's have a look at this, because everything is set to 0, 0. The coordinates I'm looking at are here. Everything is pretty much matching exactly as we thought it would. There's a table across direction, but it doesn't really matter because the rows are pretty much just working in the windows that are the same as sum of cells, essentially the cell in this particular case. If we then, however, change this to 1 and we hit apply, then we get an error, because essentially what Tableau can't do is go it can't find a row that doesn't exist. This is why this is thrown an error. Essentially, we've sort of hit the end of the wall and we're asking it to do the impossible. And so that just returns a null. If we instead do this and just set 0, and let's say we do a 1 on this end and hit apply, well, this works fine, because essentially we're asking it to move in a direction that actually currently works. So let's try and decipher what's going on here. Let's hit this. We're going to table across then down. Okay, and so let's have a look and see if we can sort of make sense of what's going on. So if I grab my box here and I look at this table, you're probably thinking, okay, where is the aggregation starting? And what I tend to do is I tend to typically look for a number that makes a lot of sense for me. And the first one that makes sense is actually here on the bottom right hand side. And this is how I sort of understood Tableau. This is how I've learned Tableau. If I don't know something, I try and find something that makes sense. So these two numbers are the same. Okay. Now the number above it and the number to the left of it don't look the same at all. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of take a guess, and I'm going to assume that actually these two numbers here actually add up to 184,000. So you can see this is 184,000. And that is actually what we get in this row. So I've now got a hint as to what's going on. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort of keep going in that direction until I see what else is happening. And so if I go across, these two here add 184, these two here 147, that's what I see there. These two here have 145, that's what I see there. And then I'm a little bit stuck because I don't know where to go next. So let's try this. Let's go 77 and 62, 139. That's not what we're seeing here or here. So that's not correct. Well, the only other place it can go is to go to the row before it. So let's click on that and that. And you see that it gets 120,935. And that is actually what we get in this particular cell. So it's kind of doing this. If I sort of try and draw it on screen, it's sort of drawing these sort of small squares. I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this. That's the first one. And then this is the second one. And then the third one is sort of spread across like two boxes. It's sort of this one and that one. And then once it gets there, it kind of carries on doing its own thing. So this is actually using a table structure called across and then down. And because of the way we've defined the window, it's actually doing it from the bottom right-hand corner to the very top left-hand side. And so if I actually was to add this number and this number together, you'd get 58,580. So then these two essentially represent this particular record here. So the way this is working, it's sort of fascinating. The window sum can basically do some really weird direction in terms of the maths that it's doing. And it's all defined by what you pick. So if I was to go in here and change this, instead of table across then down, I could choose pane across then down. And then you get this. And then you're thinking, oh my word, what is happening here? Well, there is actually a logic to this. What has essentially happened is that there are some categories here that don't have any particular sales in the particular section that we're looking at. So for example, furniture doesn't sell anything when it comes to accessories, appliances, art, and binders. You can only have furniture sales in bookcases, chairs, and furnishings. And so when we actually set that to pane across and down, you're sort of forcing Tableau to do some maths in a direction that it really doesn't want to do it in. And there are no sales in that particular cell. And so you kind of get this funny behavior, and you never really want this because this makes no sense to anyone, is that you can see, let's actually go to the bottom and let's just start here. Let's go to the very bottom where we were before. So technology, the most bottom right value you can have is 105,341. And that is actually indeed what we have here. And we can actually see that working properly. Okay. Now, if we go to the next row and we get these two together, the values that we get for these two should be 184,303. And so everything is still working. That's what this is saying. But when we get to 77,000, you can see here that there is no row above it that we can use. And essentially it has to go to the row above it because I forced it to use the pane down. And so when it adds 77,391 to nothing, you get 77,391. But when it goes to this cell and it adds this cell, well, the answer is nothing. And then it will keep trundling down through this particular setup until it gets to paper over here. And then the next thing it will do is it will add this one to this one, and it will represent that over here. And so essentially it's still doing what we asked it to do, but because we're forcing it to go through the pane, it's creating data where there wasn't any data before. It's almost like it's done a secret scaffold, and this has brought back all the other sort of data items that we're sort of not interested in. So if I go back here, I shouldn't really use pane across then down in this particular setup. It's a really, really bad idea. So let's go back to table across then down, and then you can see everything else disappears. And so the main thing you want to take away from this is that, look, the window sum function is a very, very powerful function. The window itself is defined by the coordinates that you give Tableau in these two positions. You can either write those coordinates in the way that I've got on screen. So you can either write it like 0, like this. I don't know why I used O. 0, 0. You could write it like this. You can do first like this, 0. Okay. You can also do offset. So you can also write it like this. First +1, 0. Okay, so you can write it in so many different formats, and there's simply not enough time to go through all of them in this video. I just wanted to give a very basic introduction into exactly what the window function is doing. So hopefully you can sort of breach that gap and have a play for yourself and figure out how it works or how you can use it in a calculation. Now, I'll probably do a second video on this because we've definitely not done enough here, and this video has gotten a bit too long. So I'm going to call this window functions part 1. And in part 2, we'll do something a little bit more complex where we'll basically use this in a line chart, and we'll also try and use some aggregations that actually do the same thing, but you don't realize they do the same thing. I'll give you a sneak peek of what I mean by that, just so that I can whet your appetite for video 2. I'm going to hit OK here. I'm going to open up a new sheet. We're going to build exactly the same thing. I'm going to put sales on text. I'm going to put subcategory and category over here. I could have brought category and expanded it out. I know that, but I didn't. So that's what being an old hack is about. And so here we are. We've got all the numbers that we set out. Now, what you can actually do sometimes is you can go into this sum of sales. You can do a quick table calculation, and you can do a moving average. And so it actually does a moving average in the direction of the maths. So in this particular case, it's using table across. So it's going from left to right. And if I go in and edit that table average, let's say edit table calculation, you'll see that I actually get a little highlighter showing me the direction in which it's working. And you can see it's average and it's using the previous 2 values and the next 0 values. Okay. And so that's actually an interesting description because that sounds awfully familiar. And the reason it is familiar is because that is actually exactly what's going on when you use table calculation. If I actually expand this and I just double click, you'll see that Tableau is actually writing window functions for you secretly when you do all these functions like running totals, moving averages, and everything else. It's actually doing the maths for you so you don't have to figure out how to do these things yourself. So we're going to cover more of this in the next video and sort of break that down. But that function right there is essentially doing a moving average. So looking at the previous 2 values and the next 0 values. That's all it's doing. You could, of course, change that and say, give it a window of 3 items, the previous 2 and the next 1 value. That's actually 4 items. I can't count. But then if I hit enter, you'll see that that also works and it becomes a window average. We've sort of broken it free from its automatically created setup and it's gone back to being a calculation that we can use. Pro tip, we can also drag it in here and turn it into a calculation. So we can call it window average from table calculation. Okay, so man, I've rumbled a little bit. We've sort of gone around the block here. We're not done with the window function. I feel like it's an absolute beast of a function to understand, not least because every single aggregation can be used with the window function. And you can also put other aggregation inside of it. So you could do an average inside and then find out the standard window deviation of that particular thing. It gets complicated. So this is part 1. This will have to do for now. It's getting late and I'm going to have to stop recording. But in the next video, we'll obviously jump into more of this and we'll try and build some actual charts and see how the window function works in real charts. All right. Thanks for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.